It begins with a single, unselfish act, a quiet defiance against a season of despair, proving that true wealth isn't always measured in what you keep, but in what you give away. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe quiet genius always finds a way, hit that like button and subscribe for more. For Elias Cole, a man whose hands knew the language of the soil better than any spoken word, the world had shrunk to the size of his failing farm, the relentless sun, and the stack of bills on his worn kitchen table. Each notice was a fresh crack in the already parched earth of his hope, a testament to a year the sky had simply forgotten. His strength, a quiet legacy passed down through generations who had tilled this very land, was now a grim endurance, a solitary stand against an adversary he couldn't fight, only weather. He expected nothing for his final, desperate gesture of generosity, only the hollow ache of an empty truck and the fleeting warmth of having eased, for a moment, the hunger of his neighbors. But what happened next would change everything. Elias Cole was a man sculpted by the elements, his skin the color of the rich earth he cultivated, his gaze steady and deep, like the wells that had long since run dry. He'd inherited the farm from his father, who'd inherited it from his, a lineage written not in ledgers, but in the patient turning of soil, season after season. He remembered his father's words, spoken low and resonant as they'd walked these same fields. The land provides, Elias. But it also teaches. It teaches you about respect, about patience, and about sharing the bounty, no matter how small. This philosophy was etched into Elias's soul, a quiet counterpoint to the increasingly loud chorus of drought and debt that now defined his days. He'd weathered bad years before, late frosts, pestilence, meager rains, but never a year like this, where the sky itself seemed to have turned its back, leaving the land gasping and barren. His pride, a sturdy oak, was being battered, its roots exposed. Yet, his worldview remained unshaken. Community was an ecosystem, each part relying on the others, and food, as he'd later say, was meant to be shared. His closest confidant in these trying times wasn't a person, but the land itself, though now it offered little comfort. In town, Mrs. Henderson, a deacon at the local church and a woman whose kindness was as reliable as the morning sun, at least, when it wasn't scorching the earth, would often offer a quiet word of encouragement. She'd known Elias since he was a boy, had seen his father and grandfather work this same land. She understood the weight he carried. The primary antagonist was, of course, the relentless drought, a silent, suffocating force. But its accomplices were the faceless economic pressures, the bank, with its coldly polite letters hinting at foreclosure, the rising cost of everything, the shrinking returns for a small farmer's honest labor. He'd had a brief, chilling encounter months ago, not even a formal meeting, just an observation. He'd been in the county seat, trying to secure a small loan, and had overheard a sharply dressed man from a large agricultural corporation remark to a companion, "These smallholders, they're a dying breed. Can't adapt, can't compete. The dust will claim them all eventually." The casual cruelty of it had settled in Elias's gut like a stone. His world was the farm, the small town of Harmony Creek nestled in a valley that was slowly turning brown, the dusty roads that connected a community fraying at the edges but still holding on. The general store, run by old Mr. Peterson, was the hub of news and quiet commiseration. Everyone knew everyone else's struggles. The drought was a shared burden, though Elias's felt particularly acute, his farm more exposed, his reserves long since depleted. He'd always believed in the cycle of giving and receiving, of sowing and reaping. Now, as he stared at the cracked earth, all he seemed to reap was worry. Yet, even in his deepest despair, an invisible seed of a different kind was being sown by his actions, its roots spreading unseen through the parched ground of his circumstances. The decision had formed slowly, then solidified with a quiet certainty. The last of his sweet potatoes, earthy and robust, and the stubborn greens that had clung to life in a protected patch, represented the final, meager fruits of a season's desperate labor. They wouldn't save the farm. They wouldn't pay the towering bills. Sold, they might offer a few more days, a temporary reprieve, but the end felt inevitable. Elias loaded the crates onto the weathered bed of his ancient pickup truck, each movement deliberate, almost reverent. These weren't just vegetables. They were the last echoes of his family's legacy, the final reserves of his livelihood. The drive into Harmony Creek was dusty and quiet. He bypassed the market, the places where he might have haggled for a meager price. Instead, he drove to the modest homes on the outskirts of town, to the families he knew were struggling as much, if not more, than he was. His father's voice echoed in his memory, "The land gives, son. You give back. especially when there's need. He remembered, too, the quiet shame he'd felt as a child during a lean year, his own stomach aching, and the unexpected kindness of a neighbor sharing a warm loaf of bread. The memory fueled his resolve. He offered the food simply, without pronouncements or pleas for recognition. To a young mother with worried eyes, to an elderly couple whose garden had withered, to families whose tables he knew were often bare. When Mrs. Gable, her hands gnarled with arthritis but her spirit still bright, tried to offer him what little money she had, he gently shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice raspy from the dust and disuse. "Food's meant to be shared." She looked at him, tears welling. "Elias Cole, you're a good man. A better man than this world sometimes deserves." He just nodded, a lump in his throat, and moved on, the act of giving easing a fraction of the ache in his own heart, even as it sealed the fate of his farm. He returned to the empty fields, the truck bed bare, his pockets just as empty. A profound weariness settled over him, heavier than the heat. He had done what he felt was right, but the reality of his situation pressed in. The bank's final notice lay on the kitchen table, its stark black print a death sentence for his way of life. Days blurred into a routine of grim expectation. He still walked the fields, his hands, raw and blistered from a lifetime of labor, tracing the cracks in the earth as if searching for a pulse that was no longer there. Word of his sacrifice, however, had begun to travel, carried on the whispers of those he'd fed, then amplified by those they told. It moved like a gentle breeze through Harmony Creek, a counter-narrative to the despair of the drought. Children who'd eaten his sweet potatoes told their friends. Parents shared the story at the church, at the general store. The tale of the quiet farmer who, facing his own ruin, chose generosity over desperation, resonated deeply in a community starved for hope as much as for rain. Mrs. Henderson, a woman of quiet influence, mentioned it to her nephew, a young journalist who occasionally wrote human interest pieces for a regional paper. He didn't pursue it immediately, but the seed was planted. Elias, oblivious to this subtle ripple effect, felt the vice tighten. Mr. Davies, the bank manager, a man Elias had known since they were boys playing stickball in the churchyard, paid him a visit. Davies was uncomfortable, his eyes avoiding Elias's direct gaze. "Elias," he began, his voice formal, strained. "I'm afraid the bank has to proceed. The auction date will be set for next month if the arrears aren't cleared." Elias nodded slowly. "I understand, Tom. You've got your job to do." There was no anger in his voice, only a profound sadness. "Rules are rules, Elias," Davies said, a hint of apology in his tone, though it changed nothing. That evening, as Elias sat on his porch, watching the merciless sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that felt like a mockery of beauty, Mrs. Henderson arrived with a covered dish. "Just a little something, Elias," she said, her smile gentle. "The boy, little Timmy Gable, he hasn't stopped talking about those sweet potatoes. Said they were the best he's ever had." She didn't mention the farm, the bank, or the future. She just offered a small measure of the kindness he had shown, returning it in kind. The simple meal, a casserole rich with cheese and concern, was more nourishing than anything Elias had eaten in weeks. It didn't change his circumstances, but it chipped away at the isolation that had begun to encase him. He felt a flicker of warmth, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, the sun rose with the same unforgiving glare. Elias felt the weight of inevitability settle upon him like the dust that coated everything. He had given all he had. There was nothing left to do but wait for the end, for the finality of the auctioneer's gavel. Or so he thought. He was out in the north field, listlessly pulling up withered tomato vines, the work more a habit than a hope, when he first heard it, a distant, rhythmic whirring. He paused, sweat stinging his eyes, and listened. The sound grew, deeper, more insistent, unlike anything he usually heard in this quiet corner of the county. He squinted at the blazing sky. Then he saw it, a sleek, dark shape descending, rotors beating the dry air into a maelstrom, kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured the sun. A helicopter. Here, on his land. Elias stood frozen, his heart pounding a strange rhythm against his ribs. Helicopters meant emergencies, police, or perhaps wealthy landowners surveying their vast holdings. None of those scenarios made sense for him. The machine, an impossibly sophisticated piece of technology against the backdrop of his antiquated, failing farm, settled onto the parched earth of the fallow field with a final sigh of its turbines. The dust began to settle, revealing a machine that gleamed even in the harsh light. A side door slid open. Elias remained where he was, 100 yards away, his hands still clutching a dead vine, a mixture of disbelief, apprehension, and a sudden, inexplicable flicker of something he hadn't felt in months: curiosity. He watched as a figure emerged, silhouetted against the glare. The man was tall, dressed not in work clothes but in a crisp shirt and tailored trousers that spoke of a world far removed from Harmony Creek. He took a few steps, looked around, then spotted Elias. Elias slowly let the vine fall from his hand. He wiped his dusty palms on his overalls, a gesture of ingrained habit, and began to walk towards the stranger, his old boots crunching on the baked soil. His mind raced. Who was this man? What could he possibly want? Was it the bank, sending someone in a more dramatic fashion to survey the property before the auction? Or perhaps someone who'd heard the farm was for sale, though no sign had yet been posted. As he drew closer, he could see the man's face more clearly. He was younger than Elias, perhaps in his late 40s, with an air of quiet authority and an unexpectedly kind expression in his eyes. The dust from the landing still swirled faintly around them, the only movement in the otherwise still, oppressive heat. The silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the ticking cool of the helicopter's engine and the distant caw of a crow. "Elias Cole?" the stranger asked, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the quiet air. Elias nodded, his throat suddenly dry. Yes. He was wary, his gaze steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. He'd faced down too much hardship to be easily intimidated, but this was beyond any experience he could draw upon. "My name is Marcus Thorne," the man said, extending a hand. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. Thorne's grip was firm, decisive. "I read a small piece about you. About what you did in town with your crops." Elias felt a flush creep up his neck. He hadn't expected his actions to travel beyond the grateful recipients. He said nothing, merely offering a slight, almost imperceptible nod, still trying to understand the purpose of this visit. Thorne seemed to sense his confusion, his unspoken questions. "That was a remarkable thing to do, Mr. Cole. Especially given," he paused, his gaze sweeping briefly over the desolate landscape. "Well, given the obvious difficulties you're facing." Elias finally found his voice, the words simple, echoing the sentiment he'd expressed to Mrs. Gable. "Food's meant to be shared." A small smile touched Thorne's lips. "Indeed, it is. My grandmother, she grew up not far from here, during even harder times than this. She used to say something very similar. She believed that what you give comes back to you, often in ways you least expect." He paused, his expression turning more serious. "Mr. Cole, I'm not here to buy your sweet potatoes or your land in the usual sense." Elias listened, his mind struggling to process the incongruity of the moment. This wealthy man, this gleaming helicopter, standing in his ruined field, talking about shared food and grandmothers. It felt surreal. He braced himself for some kind underscore of complicated offer, perhaps a low ball bid for the farm now that its vulnerability was so starkly apparent. "I run a foundation," Thorne continued, "one that invests in sustainable agriculture and community-led initiatives. The story of your generosity, your quiet integrity in the face of such personal hardship, it reached us. It's rare, Mr. Cole. In my world, it's exceedingly rare to find someone who, with so little, gives so much." Elias felt a lifetime of ingrained skepticism warring with a nascent, almost painful flicker of hope. He'd learned the hard way that offers that sounded too good to be true usually were. Yet, there was a sincerity in Thorne's eyes, a directness that cut through his apprehension. "I'm not interested in a handout, Mr. Thorne," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm, his pride asserting itself. "I'm not offering one," Thorne replied, his respect for Elias evident. "I'm offering a partnership, a chance to not only save this farm, but to make it a beacon. We have resources, access to new irrigation techniques, drought-resistant crops, ways to restore the soil. What we often lack is the human element, the wisdom, the deep connection to the land, the kind of character you've demonstrated." Thorne gestured towards the parched fields. "This land has memory, Mr. Cole, and so do you. I want to invest in this farm. But more than that," he met Elias's gaze directly, "I want to invest in you." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Elias looked from Thorne to the helicopter, then to his own calloused, earth-stained hands. He thought of his father, of the generations who had poured their lives into this soil. He thought of the bills on his table, the auction notice. And then, he thought of the children eating sweet potatoes, their faces lit with simple joy. The decision wasn't a calculation. It was an acceptance, a quiet yielding to a hope he hadn't dared to entertain. A slow understanding dawned that this man wasn't offering charity that would diminish him, but an opportunity that could affirm everything he stood for. Why? Elias asked, the single word encompassing all his disbelief and cautious curiosity. Thorne smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression. Because, Mr. Cole, the world needs more people like you. People who understand that the true harvest isn't always what you pull from the earth, but what you plant in the hearts of others. My grandmother would have liked you. And frankly, he added, a touch of pragmatism in his voice, investing in proven integrity is always a sound business decision. A long silence followed. Elias looked out over his land, the land that had nearly broken him, and for the first time in a long, long time, he saw not an ending, but the faintest glimmer of a new beginning. He turned back to Marcus Thorne, a decision forming not in his mind, but in his very soul. He extended his hand again, not in greeting this time, but in agreement. All right, Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice steady. Let's talk about this partnership. The helicopter ascended, its sound gradually fading into the vast, indifferent blue, leaving Elias standing alone in the field, the dust settling around him like a benediction. A slow smile spread across his face, easing the lines of worry etched there by months of hardship. He took a deep, shaky breath, the air feeling suddenly lighter, cleaner. The relief was immense, a physical unburdening. He looked down at his blistered hands. They no longer felt like symbols of futile toil, but of an act that had, almost miraculously, sown a future. The arrangement discussed with Thorne wasn't just about saving his farm. It aimed to create a model for sustainable agriculture in the region, a community-focused enterprise that could serve as a beacon against the encroaching grip of drought and debt for others too. Marcus Thorne had left behind not just a business card, but a detailed proposal that outlined a collaborative venture. Elias wouldn't be an employee on his own land. He would be its chief steward, his lifelong knowledge and wisdom finally valued, a partner in shaping its future. The rains would still be an uncertainty, the work still demanding, but now there was a foundation of tangible hope, a shared strength to draw upon. Later that evening, Elias sat on his porch. The damning pile of bills still lay on the weathered table, but now, beside them, rested Thorne's card and the folder outlining a future he hadn't dared to dream of just hours before. He picked up a handful of the dry, cracked soil from a nearby planter. This time, it didn't crumble into dust with the same finality. Instead, it felt like a promise waiting to be nurtured. He thought of his granddaughter, Sarah, who lived in the city but loved her summer visits to the farm. He imagined the stories he could now tell her, not just of hardship and struggle, but of how a single, heartfelt act of giving, of sharing what little he had, could water the most barren ground and bring forth an unexpected harvest. The sun began to set, casting long, gentle shadows across the land he had almost lost. Elias Cole watched it, a quiet man on a quiet farm, understanding with a profound clarity that the truest harvest was not always the one pulled from the earth, but the one sown in the hearts of others. This story reminds us that acts of kindness, no matter how small they seem, can ripple outwards in ways we can never predict, sometimes changing not just one life, but many. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.